admit this, but important as the Fed is, I've avoided doing shows about it because the Fed is, well, boring and confusing. When I asked people what it was, this was really a typical answer. What's the Fed?
The what? The Fed?
The Fed.
FED, Fed? The federal government?
People know very little about the Federal Reserve, even though it has the power to play around with trillions of our dollars. So I should report on it, but the details are boring, and I work on competitive television. So if I bore you and you stop watching, I lose my job. I lose this show, which I'd like to keep. So I've avoided this show on the Fed until now. After all, you don't see any writers putting out bestsellers about the Fed. Well, actually, you do. One, Brad Thor, and his latest book, Hidden Order, is a bestseller, and it's about the Fed. So why'd you put in this boring institution?
It's actually not that boring, and I write thrillers, so my job is to give you a great beach read from cover to cover. But if you walk away from the book having learned more, then I think that's icing on the cake. And for me, the Fed is fascinating, particularly how much secrecy it shrouds itself with on purpose.
They formed it in secret.
Absolutely. There were a bunch of bankers with a few government officials that stole out of New York City one night in 1910. Didn't even use the train station here. They went to Hoboken so nobody would see them. Said they were going on a duck hunting trip. And they went down to Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia and hatched this big plan to launch the third central bank in America's history.
Two previous ones had failed and been killed.
Absolutely.
But you make it seem sinister. Maybe they were just trying not to roil the markets.
The central banks were incredibly unpopular with the American people. In fact, all the participants that went down to Jekyll Island used assumed names or only first names because they didn't want this to get out. They knew this was not going to go over well with the American people. Because the Eastern bankers were hated at this time in America's history.
They were viewed as manipulators of the ordinary people.
Absolutely. And you had banks booming in the South, in the West, and you also had businesses deciding, we don't need the banks, we're going to take our profits and reinvest them in our own businesses. So this cabal got together to save and monopolize the banking industry for themselves.
And as you say, it was the third. The first one was in 1791. It lasted about 20 years. With the war debt taken care of, people no longer saw the need. Congress closed it. They didn't want a central bank.
They did not.
The second bank, 1816, Andrew Jackson closed it. He said it was susceptible to corruption.
Absolutely. You can look at Thomas Paine, who inspired the American Revolution with his pamphlet, Common Sense, said that central banking, in particular the printing of money, was the surest road to despotism and the loss of liberty.
All right, but today, most of the so-called experts say we need a central bank. It makes sure inflation is moderate. It helps with employment.
That's the smoke that comes out of the Federal Reserve. One of the biggest...
But more than the Federal Reserve. You talk to any smart financial person around.
How about this? You're a capitalist, I'm a capitalist. We both like free markets. Yeah. Everything needs to have some sort of a litmus test to tell you if it's working. The dollar has lost 96% of its value since the Fed came on the scene. We had the Great Depression under the Fed.
Many years ago. We did have the Great Depression.
20 years after the Fed came around.
Now Milton Friedman pointed out they made a mistake, and they've learned from their mistake.
Well, the Fed has redefined the term inflation over 20 times since the 1970s. There's a lot of things. Again, I write thrillers, and I picked the Fed because I thought this shadowy, all the stuff in there is not conspiracy theory, John. The stuff I put in was well-researched data and history about the Fed that I think people will find fascinating, wrapped in a great thriller.
And one thing I love about your book is that you have the hero read Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Easy Lesson.
It really is economics in one easy lesson. And the founders warned us that the greatest threat to our liberty was ignorance of currency, coinage, and how the monetary system works. So as an American, it's important for me to at least raise these issues in the public square.
Well, I'm glad you brought your talents to this important subject. Thank you, Brad Thor. Coming up, why would you give this woman permission to spend $4 trillion of